Welcome to the Deep Dive. Ready to dive into some deep stuff? We're going to be tackling ontology, epistemology, the kind of concepts that maybe make your brain hurt a little bit at first glance.
But stick with us.
Yeah, stick with us. We're going to unpack it all. And we're really focusing on how those ideas shape the research we see in the world, especially in psychology.
Right. You've been, checking out excerpts from academic texts, even a blog post that I know got you thinking.
It did get me thinking. And that's what we're here for. We're not just going to define terms, though we'll definitely do that, but we want to help you actually use these concepts, ontology, epistemology, like tools for thinking critically.
About psychology. And maybe even life itself.
Okay, so maybe before we get too philosophical. Yeah. The Open University source we have, it starts off with some pretty down-to-earth questions. Like what happens when we learn a language? Or why are some people just naturally good at math while others are, like, musical geniuses?
Right. And, those are the kind of questions that psychologists are trying to answer all the time.
They are.
And to do that, they really have to consider these big three: ontology, epistemology, and methodology.
Okay, so hit me with it. Ontology first. What is that all about?
Ontology is all about the nature of reality. Like, is there one objective truth out there just waiting for us to discover it? Or is reality more, like clay, something that's molded by our own experiences?
So is it one mountain we're all looking at? Or is everyone seeing something different based on where they're standing, their perspective?
That's a great way to put it. Now, how do we even know what we know about that mountain, about reality in general? That's where epistemology comes in.
Okay, so epistemology.
It asks, can we ever be truly objective, or is all knowledge, like you were saying, tinted by our perspective, maybe even our biases?
It's not just what's real, but how we can even be sure we know anything about it.
Exactly. And then there's methodology. Think of this as the bridge between those two. It's the how-to of research, right? What are the strategies, the plans that we use to answer the questions we have? And how does the method we choose? Does it actually reflect what we already believe about reality and how we know things?
It's like you wouldn't use a whisk to chop vegetables.
Right.
The tool has to fit the job.
Exactly. And, when we're talking about these big philosophical ideas, one of the, I guess you could say most common debates is between positivism and constructivism.
Ah, yes. The classic showdown. Yeah. So break it down for me. What is positivism all about?
Okay, so positivism is all about that objective truth. Think scientific method, controlled experiments, data that you can measure.
Hard facts.
Yeah, hard fact. It's kind of like saying, okay, there's a formula for happiness, and we can find it if we just look hard enough.
So like a positivist would design a study where they measure, brain activity, hormone levels, when people are eating chocolate.
Exactly.
To see if there's like a measurable happiness response.
Exactly. They're looking for that cause and effect, that universal law that says chocolate equals happiness. But then you have constructivism, which comes at it from a totally different angle.
Right. Constructivism is more like, hold on a second. Everyone experiences happiness differently.
Right.
It's not one-size-fits-all kind of thing.
It's much more nuanced.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So instead of, like, hooking people up to brain scanners, the constructivist might actually sit down with people and have a conversation. Really listen to their stories, ask them about their personal experiences with happiness, what it means to them, what triggers it for them.
Right. What makes them light up? What are their unique experiences?
Exactly. And that blog post we have, it actually talks about how these different beliefs about reality, like those ontological stances, they really directly affect how we think we can know things, our epistemology.
Right.
Which then impacts the research choices we make.
It's a chain reaction.
It is. But hold on a sec, because it's not always just positivism versus constructivism, is it?
No, not at all.
Our sources also mention realism and pragmatism, which bring even more perspectives into the mix, more tools for our toolbox.
Right, more tools. So realism, for example, it says that, okay, yeah, reality exists whether we think about it or not, but we perceive it through our senses.
Yeah.
And sometimes our senses are accurate, and sometimes
not so much.
Not so much. So critical thinking is really key.
Like, my senses tell me that this table is solid, but, on a molecular level, it's mostly empty space.
Yeah.
It's all about how we interpret what we're sensing.
Exactly. And then you have pragmatism, which is, It's less about finding the one true way and more about what works best to answer this specific question.
Right.
Maybe they would even combine positivism and constructivism, like a little mix and match for maximum effectiveness.
Right. It's about being flexible, using the best tool for the job, regardless what philosophical camp you're in. But this makes me think, with all these different perspectives swirling around, how do researchers even choose?
That's where self-awareness comes in. You know, that ontology epistemology source really emphasizes that researchers need to be aware of their own assumptions, their own biases.
Which we all have.
Right.
No one comes at this with a completely blank slate.
No one. And being aware of those biases can help you choose the best research design, the methods that fit both the question you're asking and your own philosophical outlook.
Speaking of research design, that table in the social research excerpt, it really lays it all out there. Factors like axiology, which is about the role of values in research.
Right. And then even how data is collected. It all changes depending on the researcher's chosen approach.
It really shows how those philosophical stances, they impact every single stage of the research, from the initial question to the way we actually gather the information.
It does. And speaking of questions, that's where research design gets really interesting. Are we trying to prove that something exists? Or describe a phenomenon in detail? Or pinpoint a cause and effect relationship?
It's like that activity in the Open Learn source, where we explore different psychological lenses on happiness. How would a cognitive psychologist approach it versus a social psychologist?
Right.
Totally different starting points, I'm guessing.
Yeah, totally. I mean, each discipline, each researcher, they bring their own assumptions and preferred methods to the table. And those choices have a huge impact on the conclusions they ultimately draw.
So for all of us out there just consuming this information, this is why understanding these concepts is like having a superpower. It helps us to critically evaluate the research we're reading. We can ask, what are this researcher's assumptions? Did they choose methods that line up with their goals? Do I buy what they're selling? It's like we're developing our own internal BS detectors.
Absolutely. And that's key in a world that's just overflowing with information.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. You guys have already done some serious brain work, really unpacking ontology, epistemology, and methodology, those philosophical ideas behind research.
Yeah, it's heavy stuff.
It is. But now it's time to see those ideas in action, right?
Yeah.
Like, how do they actually play out in different areas of psychological research?
Right, putting that knowledge to work.
Exactly. So let's jump into one area where these philosophical debates really come alive, and that's happiness.
Makes sense. I mean, we all want to be happy.
We do.
But how we define it, how we study it, all depends on, what researchers believe about reality and knowledge.
It's like, are we trying to find the happy chemicals in the brain? Or are we trying to understand, like, the whole big picture of what makes a person feel fulfilled? Those are two very different things.
Totally different. And remember those two contrasting approaches we talked about, positivism and constructivism.
Yeah.
So a positivist researcher, with that focus on finding universal laws, they might design a study that looks at measurable things like, brain activity.
Right. They might use brain imaging, like fMRI, to see which parts of the brain light up when people experience joy. Or maybe analyze blood samples, see if there's any connection between happiness levels and certain hormones.
Yeah, exactly. They're looking for those objective biological markers, the hard science of happiness, you could say.
But a constructivist would come at it from a completely different angle.
Right, totally. Much more focused on the subjective experience. What does it feel like to be happy?
So instead of brain scans, they're having conversations with people, really listening to their stories.
Yeah.
Asking them what happiness means to them, what makes their hearts sing.
Exactly. And then they might analyze the language people use, the stories they tell, even cultural nuances.
Right. It's like comparing a spreadsheet to a poem.
I like that, yeah.
One is quantifying happiness, the other is trying to capture its essence. It's much more qualitative.
And neither approach is right or wrong. It's just different ways of knowing, different goals for the research.
And this is where I think pragmatism comes in. Sometimes the best research blends these approaches.
Oh, absolutely.
You use both quantitative data, like from surveys, and qualitative data, like from those in-depth interviews, to get a more well-rounded picture.
Right, like a detective piecing together clues from different sources.
Exactly. Okay, so we've got different approaches to gathering information, but what about interpreting that data? Can two researchers look at the same results and come to different conclusions?
All the time. Even with the same data, a researcher's philosophical assumptions, those really color their interpretation. Let's say a study finds a correlation between exposure to violent video games and aggressive behavior in kids.
Oh, yeah, that's a hot-button issue.
It is.
So how would a positivist approach those findings?
Well, a positivist, they love cause and effect, right?
Yeah.
So they might see that correlation and say, aha, violent video games directly cause aggression. They might argue the data clearly shows a link, and that link is probably due to something happening in the brain.
But a constructivist might not jump to that conclusion so quickly.
No. They would probably acknowledge the correlation, but point out all the other factors that could be at play. Family dynamics, social environment, individual differences in how susceptible a kid is to those media influences.
Right. It's not as simple as video games equal violence.
Exactly. A constructivist might want to understand, like, the meaning kids attribute to those games. Do they even interpret the violence the same way?
Right. Does it actually change their real-world behavior?
Right. So they might use qualitative methods like interviews to really explore those questions. Same data, different interpretations, all because of those underlying philosophical beliefs.
It's like those optical illusions where you can see two different images depending on how you look at it.
Exactly.
And that's why understanding these concepts is so crucial. It helps us be more informed consumers of information. We start asking, what are the beliefs shaping these claims? What methods were used? Does it all add up for me?
Yeah, it's like you're developing your own internal BS detector.
Exactly. Which is pretty handy in a world overflowing with information.
Absolutely.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We've been on quite the journey, haven't we? Exploring how these really big ideas, ontology, epistemology, methodology, actually play out in the real world of psychological research.
Yeah, we've covered some ground. Happiness, violent video games.
Right.
But now we're going to tackle a real head-scratcher, consciousness.
Okay, yeah, that's a big one. What is consciousness? How does it even work? These questions have been around forever, and it doesn't seem like we're any closer to a definitive answer.
Nope. And that's where those philosophical stances that we've been talking about, they really come into play here. Because how you approach studying consciousness, it really depends on what you believe about the nature of reality itself.
So let's say you're a researcher, and you're coming at this from a more materialist, positivist perspective. Where would you even begin to study something as slippery as consciousness?
Well, I think you might start by looking for what we call the neural correlates of consciousness. So specific brain regions or patterns of activity that seem to be linked to conscious experience.
So like hooking someone up to an EEG or an fMRI and seeing what their brain is doing while they're, I don't know, performing a task, making a decision, or even just describing what they're feeling.
Exactly. You're essentially trying to find the physical basis of consciousness to show that it's all really just brain activity at the end of the day.
But wouldn't a constructivist push back on that a little?
Oh, for sure. They might argue that reducing consciousness to just brain activity is like, I don't know, trying to understand a painting by analyzing the chemical composition of the paint.
Right, you're missing the artistry, the emotion, the meaning behind it.
Exactly. For a constructivist, understanding consciousness is less about pinpointing brain regions and more about exploring the subjective experience of what it feels like to be conscious.
So instead of brain scans, maybe they're doing in-depth interviews, asking people to really describe their inner world, their thoughts, feelings, perceptions.
Yeah, or they might even use some more creative methods, like asking people to express their conscious experience through art, music, or even writing. It's all about capturing that richness and complexity.
So we've got two very different approaches here, each with its own strengths and weaknesses. But it highlights an important point, doesn't it? Maybe the best way to study something as complex as consciousness is to integrate multiple perspectives.
I think so too. We need both the objective scientific lens and the subjective experiential lens to really understand something like consciousness. And this brings up another really crucial aspect of research that's heavily influenced by our philosophical assumptions: ethics.
Okay, I can see how ethics would be a huge consideration when you're studying something as personal as consciousness. But how do ontology and epistemology play into that?
Well, think about it this way. If you believe that there's only one objective reality out there, and that researchers are just neutral observers, you might not be as worried about how your research actually affects the people you're studying.
So you're more focused on getting the pure data, even if it means using methods that some people might find a little intrusive or manipulative?
Right. But if you believe that reality is constructed and that researchers are always a part of the equation, you're going to be much more sensitive to the ethical implications.
Right. You're going to think carefully about things like informed consent, making sure participants really understand the risks and benefits. You'll be more aware of the power dynamics at play, the fact that researchers have a certain authority that can influence how people respond.
Exactly. So our philosophical assumptions, they don't just shape how we design and interpret research. They guide how we conduct that research ethically.
And as we wrap up this deep dive, I think it's really important to remember that these debates about ontology, epistemology, and methodology, they're not going away anytime soon. There's no one right answer, no single approach that everyone agrees on.
And that's what makes research so exciting. The field is always evolving. New methods are being developed. New theories are emerging. It's a dynamic process.
And for all of us out there, it's a reminder to always think critically about the information we're taking in. What are the assumptions behind this study? What methods did they use? Does this resonate with my understanding of the world?
Those are the questions that make us informed, discerning consumers of knowledge.
Exactly. So keep asking those questions, stay curious, and never stop exploring this fascinating world of research.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.